For 284 years, this Roman object defeated every specialist who ever handled it. The finest minds in archaeology turned it around, debated endlessly, and eventually walked away. Then Grok AI examined it and in a single computational pass cracked what nearly 3 centuries of human brilliance could not. The answer had been concealed within the geometry all along, recurring across objects crafted centuries apart by people who never crossed paths. And it is not a reassuring answer. What the analysis revealed does not merely resolve the mystery, it replaces it with something considerably darker, a truth the ancient world once possessed and then lost so thoroughly that we could no longer recognize it when it stared back at us from behind museum glass. The object no one could name. Here is what analysts were looking at, and why it confounded 3 centuries of specialists before AI ever engaged with it. The Roman Dodecahedron is a small, hollow object cast in bronze or copper alloy with 12 pentagonal faces. Every single one of those 12 faces is pierced with a circular opening. The holes are not uniform. They differ in diameter, and that variation follows a distinct pattern that repeats reliably within each individual specimen. Every one of the 20 vertices, the points where the pentagonal faces converge, is topped with a small, spherical knob. These objects are not particularly large. They typically measure somewhere between 4 and 11 centimeters in height and weigh anywhere between 35 and 580 grams. Every example recovered with a reliable archaeological context dates to the same period, somewhere between the 2nd and 4th century AD. And across nearly 3 centuries of study by professional archaeologists, classicists, and Roman historians, not a single one has ever been identified to anyone's satisfaction. The first one entered the modern record in 1739. It was pulled from a field near Aston in Hertfordshire, England, and reported to the Society of Antiquaries. That publication triggered 2 simultaneous reactions: intense fascination and complete bewilderment. The object was unmistakably Roman. The metalwork, the style, the archaeological context all pointed without any ambiguity toward the Roman period. But its purpose was an absolute blank. It matched nothing in the known catalog of Roman artifacts. Sit with that for a moment. This was not some obscure curiosity glanced at once and tucked onto a shelf. The most serious antiquarian institution in the country examined a clearly Roman object in good condition. And the conclusion was essentially a shrug. No comparable artifact, no written reference, no tradition that could account for it. In the centuries that followed, roughly 130 more turned up in farmers' fields, in building foundations, in old collections whose origins had been forgotten, in deliberate burial deposits alongside coins and other valuables. Each new discovery should have sharpened the picture. Instead, everyone deepened the puzzle, because each fresh specimen confirmed the same maddening combination: undeniable craftsmanship, undeniable expense, undeniable Roman origin, and absolutely no explanation. And as the collection of known examples grew, a second pattern emerged, one stranger than the objects themselves, a distribution that points somewhere deliberate. The dodecahedra do not spread randomly across the empire. They cluster, and that cluster points unmistakably at something. They appear in Roman Britain with considerable frequency. They appear in Roman Gaul, the territory of modern France. They appear in the Germanic provinces along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. They appear in the Alpine provinces. They appear in Pannonia, the Roman region corresponding to modern Hungary, and the surrounding territories. Now consider where they are entirely absent. Not in Italy, not in Greece, not in North Africa, not in Egypt, not in Syria, not in any of the major provinces of the Eastern Mediterranean, the places where Roman civilization was oldest, most deeply rooted, and most thoroughly recorded in surviving texts. If this had been a religious object or a marker of elite standing, it should appear there above all else. It does not. If it had been an ordinary household implement, it should turn up wherever people maintained households. It does not. It exists almost exclusively within that band of territory where Rome was actively pushing forward, establishing garrisons, and engineering its presence into resistant lands. And it is essentially invisible everywhere Rome was simply inhabiting. An artifact does not distribute itself that way by coincidence. Something about its purpose linked it directly to the frontier regions. That pattern had been sitting in museum display cases all across Europe the entire time. The objects were openly visible. Their distribution had been carefully recorded. What no one possessed was the ability to interpret what any of it actually meant. To appreciate how strange that truly is, you need to understand how these things were physically created, crafted with intentional exactness. A dodecahedron in pure geometry is a three-dimensional solid with 12 flat faces. In its regular form, the one Plato associated with the cosmos itself in his famous dialogue, every face is an identical regular pentagon. The Roman objects are not regular dodecahedra in the strict mathematical sense. They are hollow. Every pentagonal face is opened up with a circular hole, and those holes vary in size in a controlled, repeating arrangement. The vertices are finished with rounded spherical knobs that add weight, alter how the object rests in the hand, and could have served as fixed reference points for alignment purposes. They were produced using lost wax casting. A wax model is constructed, encased in clay to form a mold, then subjected to heat until the wax melts away, leaving behind a negative cavity shaped exactly like the original. Molten metal is then poured inside. Once it cools, the mold is broken apart, and the finished bronze piece emerges. This is not a casual or simple process. It demands skill, precision, and materials that were far from easy to come by in the ancient world. Bronze was genuinely valuable. Copper and tin both had to be mined, smelted, and transported across distances. A cast bronze object of any real complexity represented a significant investment of resources, and the dodecahedra are anything but rough. The pentagonal faces are regular. The circular openings are clean and consistent. The spherical knobs are uniform. The overall geometry demonstrates a level of manufacturing control that required both mathematical knowledge and real technical mastery. These were not casual folk items thrown together by untrained hands. They were professional objects produced by craftspeople who understood precisely what they were doing. Keep that in mind, because every failed theory collapses on exactly that point. 4 theories and how each one falls apart. Explanations accumulated across nearly 3 centuries. Each one addressed one aspect of the object. Each one contradicted some other aspect. Walk through them, because the manner in which they fail tells the whole story. The candle holder theory proposed that the holes accommodated candles of varying sizes. The knobs acted as feet, and the bronze material resisted heat well enough. It falls apart immediately. Why would a candle holder require precise geometric construction? Why would the hole sizes follow a mathematical pattern rather than simply matching candle dimensions? And why a distribution that completely bypasses the Italian heartland, where candles were equally useful? It accounts for nothing. The knitting tool theory gained genuine momentum when a researcher demonstrated on video that a dodecahedron could function to knit gloves. It is also fatally compromised. Not a single fiber remnant, yarn fragment, or any knitting material whatsoever has ever been recovered from even one specimen. There are no wear marks from yarn being drawn repeatedly across the surfaces. The concentration in military contexts is wrong for a domestic household craft, and the mathematics simply do not support it. Different hands require different glove sizes, so the variation would be continuous and individual, but the holes are discrete, proportional, and consistent across specimens. Glove production cannot explain that. The religious object theory drew on the dodecahedron's connection to Platonic philosophy, the 5th solid representing the substance of the heavens. It accounts for the geometric shape and nothing beyond that. Why would a sacred symbol require varying hole sizes? Why invest so heavily in cast bronze rather than carved stone? And why would it appear only along the frontier, far removed from where Platonic philosophy was actually studied and debated? The gaming piece theory meets the simplest objection of all. Nobody commits that quantity of precious metal and skilled casting labor to produce a game token. Notice the shape of each failure. Every theory addresses one feature while undermining another. The form, the holes, the precision, the materials, the geography. No single explanation resolves all of them simultaneously. And here is what ought to genuinely unsettle you. The object that ultimately resolved all of them at once was never concealed anywhere. It had been sitting behind glass in museums across Europe, openly displayed, catalogued, and photographed for 284 years. The answer was never hidden away in some buried chamber. It had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Nobody possessed the right tool to decode it until Grok AI came along. The surveyor's domain. Before the mathematics entered the picture, one particular theory had edged closer to the truth than all the others. And it emerged from examining how the empire was physically constructed. Rome ran on infrastructure. Roads linked every corner of imperial territory together. Aqueducts carried water across vast stretches of land. Military encampments were arranged with exacting geometric discipline. Cities were designed according to standardized blueprints. The entire machinery of Roman power depended on the capacity to measure, survey, and build across unfamiliar and often unwelcoming terrain. Picture one of the men who actually performed that work. A Roman land surveyor, an agrimensor, standing in the early morning light on freshly conquered ground that has no roads yet, no established boundaries, no order whatsoever, wet grass underfoot, unfamiliar hills all around, a tree line that could conceal almost anything, with a legion standing behind him, expecting him to transform raw wilderness into a structured grid before sundown. That pressure is the essential thing to hold on to. He is no scholar sitting comfortably in a library. He is a technician operating in threatening territory who must produce precise lines quickly, lines that other men will lay permanent stonework upon with absolutely no margin for error. These men establish the boundaries of farms and colonies, roads and fortifications. Their profession is documented through the surviving writings of the Roman surveying corps. They used recognized instruments, the groma, a cross-shaped device mounted on a pole for sighting perpendicular lines, and the chorobates, a leveling instrument described by Vitruvius. Those tools are thoroughly documented, but here lies the gap that has persistently troubled researchers who examine this subject closely. There is simply no reason to assume those were the only instruments the surveyors carried with them. And a man working under that degree of pressure in that kind of terrain would want every reliable tool he could get his hands on. The surveying theory proposes that dodecahedra functioned as rangefinders or calibration gauges, instruments designed for measuring angles or distances out in the field. A rangefinder operates on established geometry. If you know the actual size of a distant object and the angle it takes up within your field of vision, you can calculate exactly how far away it is. Basic trigonometry. And the Romans understood this perfectly well. Hold the dodecahedron at arm's length. Sight through different holes toward a reference of known height, such as a surveying pole. The hole that frames it precisely tells you the distance. This accounts for the varying hole sizes. It accounts for the precision of the objects. It accounts for their geographic distribution perfectly. A Roman legion on campaign was never merely a fighting force. It was a mobile engineering corps. It constructed a fortified marching camp at the close of nearly every day's advance. It cut roads arrow straight across hills and valleys. It bridged rivers and erected forts whose dimensions repeat themselves across the entire frontier. None of that is achievable without measurement carried out in the field, fast, repeatable, by people trained to produce identical results every single time. Consider what that kind of work demanded from an instrument. Not precision alone. Anyone can be precise given enough time. It demanded speed under pressure, in poor weather, in terrain where you simply could not pause to work through lengthy calculations with a threatening tree line at your back. It demanded that two entirely different surveyors in two separate provinces, who would never encounter one another, arrive at the same measurement from the same sighting, so the road one of them began could be completed by the other, and still connect in exactly the right place. That eliminates anything fragile, anything slow, anything that relied on the personal judgment of whoever happened to be holding it. It points precisely toward the kind of object the dodecahedron represents. Compact, sturdy, cast in metal, calibrated. The answer read directly from the geometry rather than calculated in someone's head. The tools traveled alongside the surveyors. They appear in the places where surveyors worked. They disappear in regions where infrastructure was already complete and major surveying activity had ceased. The pattern aligns with the dodecahedron distribution with remarkable consistency, but matching the geography is not proof on its own. It is motive without a physical weapon. To establish proof, someone needed to examine the mathematics embedded within the objects themselves. And nobody had the means to accomplish that until Grok AI took a closer look. The analysis that changed everything. The breakthrough did not come from an archaeologist, a classicist, or a Roman historian. It came from a physicist at the Politecnico di Torino who chose to treat these objects not as cultural relics, but as pure geometry, running computational analysis through Grok AI across documented measurements drawn from multiple specimens across the full known corpus. And here is what that analysis returned. The hole diameters within each individual specimen are not random. They follow a proportional relationship. The exact proportions shift slightly from one object to the next, which is entirely expected given that every single one was shaped by hand. But the underlying structure remains constant. The holes conform to a ratio, and that same ratio holds across specimens cast in different provinces by different craftsmen at different points in time, spanning roughly 2 centuries, made by people who could not possibly have communicated with one another. Take a moment with what that actually requires. No central workshop, no shared mold, no mechanism for one craftsman to compare his work against another's. Hundreds of miles and decades of separation between them. And yet the same proportional relationship shows up regardless. That only happens when the makers were working from a specification that existed outside of any one of them. A rule, a standard, something that moved with the people who relied on these objects. Taught and reproduced with enough precision that a craftsman in Britannia and a craftsman in Pannonia, who never met and never could have, still put identical mathematics into bronze. Here is the thing about a moment like that, sitting alone at a screen with a result no one anticipated. There is a very specific feeling when an analysis comes back too clean. You do not feel relief. You grow suspicious. You assume something has gone wrong. Because patterns this sharp do not usually survive contact with handmade objects from antiquity. The first instinct of anyone trained in physics is to try to destroy the result before believing it. The slight variation in proportions from object to object actually works in the result's favor here. That is precisely the kind of noise you would expect from human hands working toward a shared target, not the suspicious cleanliness of a fabricated signal embedded in the data. Grok AI's analysis held up, and the longer it held, the weightier the implication became, because a consistent signal across that many independent specimens is not a coincidence you can simply dismiss. It is a standard. Someone, somewhere inside the Roman system, defined a number and caused the empire's frontier to conform to it. Run it one last time against the theories that have since been set aside. Candle holders would follow whatever candles happened to be available locally, no fixed ratio. Knitting tools would be shaped around individual finger sizes, something continuous and personal. No fixed ratio. Gaming pieces would reflect arbitrary decorative decisions. No fixed ratio. A fixed ratio, reproduced across an entire empire by people who never coordinated with one another, is neither decoration nor folk craft. It is the behavior of a calibrated instrument, an object whose entire usefulness depends on conforming to a shared standard so that a measurement taken with one remains meaningful when compared against a measurement taken with another. The proportion is not a stylistic detail that happened to reappear. It is the functional heart of the object. This is the first interpretation in 284 years that accounts for the form, the holes, the precision, the materials, and the geographic spread all together in a single explanation. And Grok AI arrived at it in an afternoon, working through a dataset that had been publicly accessible for generations. That gap, centuries of human expertise on one side and a single computational pass on the other, is where this story ceases to be merely a puzzle and becomes something considerably more unsettling. In June of 2023, the case received a new and remarkable piece of evidence, and it came directly out of the earth in front of somebody. Picture a community-led excavation on farmland in Lincolnshire. A member of the Norton Disney History and Archaeology group is working inside the trench, doing the slow and unglamorous work that most digs actually consist of. Then his tool meets something that is neither soil nor stone. He pauses. He begins clearing the dirt away by hand, the way you do when some part of you already suspects what might be there. And what emerges from the earth is the largest and most completely preserved Roman dodecahedron ever unearthed on British soil. All 12 faces accounted for, all 20 knobs fully intact, the surface clean enough to be scanned at high resolution. For an amateur archaeologist participating in a community dig, this is the kind of discovery that defines an entire lifetime, rising right up into your own hands out of an open field. The people gathered around that trench did not require an expert to explain what they were looking at. They simply knew. You can picture the silence that followed, then the eruption of noise. The object was placed on public display at Lincoln Museum, and the group collaborated with academic partners to document it thoroughly. Three-dimensional scanning produced a precise digital model that could be examined computationally in ways that physical handling simply never allows. And here is why everyone working on the geometry question held their breath when that data finally came through. This object had spent roughly 2,000 years buried underground, yet it emerged almost entirely undamaged, making it the cleanest test the proportional standard would ever get to face. The measurements confirmed what the earlier Grok AI analysis had already identified across other examples. The Norton Disney dodecahedron was no outlier. It landed precisely where the mathematics said it would. That confirmation carries more weight than it might initially suggest. A pattern found across old, worn specimens always carries a quiet risk that centuries underground had distorted the very dimensions the analysis was depending on, that the ratio was partly a product of imprecise historical measurements. A pristine specimen scanned at high resolution before modern handling could introduce any degradation removes that concern entirely. If the relationship were coincidence or measurement error, a fresh, intact, independently recovered object is exactly where it would fall apart. It did not fall apart. It fit. And independent work compiling databases of dodecahedron specimens pushed the finding even further. Across more than 100 specimens, the proportional relationships in the overall diameters hold with remarkable consistency. This is no longer a pattern appearing in a small handful of objects. It is a defining property of the entire category. And the same period and the same regions also produce something else. A smaller number of icosahedra, 20-faced objects with triangular faces, far rarer, another platonic solid. If the dodecahedra were purely sacred symbols, the icosahedra should reinforce that reading. Instead, they display the same practical signature: varying holes, precise construction, expensive materials. Not separate ritual objects, but variations of the same underlying technology, which means what Grok AI identified was not a quirk of one particular shape. It was a system, and a system that vanished without a trace. The unsettling part is not the object itself. This is where the word unsettling genuinely earns its place. And it is not because the object is dark or threatening. Pull the full picture together. The Roman dodecahedra were measuring instruments used by surveyors operating along the frontiers of the empire, calibrated to a consistent mathematical standard so that different users scattered across different provinces could produce compatible results, cast by skilled craftsmen working in expensive bronze. Traveling alongside the military engineering apparatus that constructed the roads, aqueducts, fortifications, and cities that held Western and Northern Europe under Roman control for centuries, we still do not know with certainty exactly what they measured. The rangefinder interpretation is plausible but unproven. The calibration gauge interpretation is equally plausible. And that uncertainty is itself part of the point, because here is what is truly troubling, and it is epistemic in nature. This was not informal folk knowledge. This was an empire-wide measurement technology, standardized across provinces, sophisticated enough that it took Grok AI to decode the rule encoded within the metal. It was operational knowledge carried in trained hands, never committed to the surviving technical manuals, never illustrated in the surviving diagrams. And when Rome collapsed, this knowledge did not simply fade gradually away. It dropped out of the world so completely that the civilization which inherited Europe could not even recognize what the surviving examples had once been used for. Not for a decade. For 284 years, people held this object, turned it over, photographed it, displayed it under glass, and wrote academic papers about it, while the function was embedded inside the geometry the entire time. Completely unreadable, until Grok AI examined numbers that human eyes had been glossing over for generations. Sit with what that actually means. Every explanation we worked through together, candle holder, knitting frame, sacred symbol, game piece, was a human mind taking the most sophisticated artifact in the room and matching its patterns to the most ordinary thing it could picture. We did not miss the answer because the answer was concealed. We missed it because we kept stretching toward the familiar, and this object simply was not familiar. It was a precision instrument from a technical culture that has since vanished entirely. And for nearly 3 centuries, the most brilliant minds who examined it could see nothing beyond a candlestick. The geometry was a sealed message, and the one who could receive it had long since disappeared. It required Grok AI, something carrying no instinct to make the unfamiliar feel comfortable, no drive to smooth the artifact down into something already understood, to finally read what the bronze had been communicating all along. That is the piece worth carrying with you. The Romans did not conceal this. They did not encode it deliberately. They simply used it, and then they were gone, and the knowledge slipped away with the hands that once held it. What remained behind was so far beyond what any later mind could interpret that it registered as a mystery rather than a functioning tool. The object never stopped speaking. We simply lost the language, and only Grok AI could hear it once more. Which means the story of decoding the dodecahedron is not really about the dodecahedron at all. The dodecahedron was in plain view the entire time, cataloged and openly displayed, and it took 284 years and a single computational pass from Grok AI to read what had been sitting right there. So what else is resting inside a museum case at this very moment? Fully illuminated, completely visible, entirely misunderstood, waiting on an analysis that has not yet been built. Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. I do read everyone, and the strongest ideas become the next video. And if the notion of answers hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right tool to finally arrive before they reveal themselves, stirs something in you the way it does in me, subscribe and stay close. This channel exists to aim that same lens at the next impossible object.